It's 3 p.m. We are at the County Court at Law courtroom located at 2718 Highway 35 North, Rockport, Texas, 78382. And I call this workshop to order. Roll call.
Commissioner Cheney?
Here.
Commissioner Casterline?
Here.
Commissioner Russo?
Here.
Commissioner Dupnick?
Here.
Judge Garza?
Here. We've got a full court, got a full quorum. At this time, we hear from citizens to be heard. Anybody sign up? Yep. Calling anybody online? All right. Item number 1.
I move to discuss Evergreen Solutions compensation study proposed solutions. Project manager Mark Holcomb will present different options and answer questions and or requests for alternate solutions.
Second.
We've got a motion and a second, so we'll have Mr. Holcomb.
Are we going to do roll call?
Oh.
Or no, we discussed first. Sorry,
Yeah, we
never mind.
discussed.
I'm brain dead.
Mr. Holcomb, good morning. Or good afternoon.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having me. I appreciate the chance to be here again.
There, it's on.
Okay, can you hear me now? Good, okay. Well, thank you again for having me here. I appreciate the chance to be here and present to you all our findings and recommendations for today. So you all have a copy of this PowerPoint, I think, in front of you, and I'll be going through the electronic version. Yeah, it looks like it's on, but it is not. The clicker is not advanced.
It's a problematic quick.
I just need somebody else to do it, so I figured maybe hear this, but. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, so to go through, today's presentation, I've got a lot to cover with you. Some of it's a little bit of recap. So starting off with the study goals and the project phases, that's going to be a recap of, what was the contract signed with Evergreen Solutions? What was our plan and our work plan and scope, basically to address the compensation, study here that we have here. The current system findings and market results, that'll be a recap of what we found when we looked at your current system. So your internal compensation practices today, how your employees compensated within your scales, and what concerns and what strengths did we see in your system. Then the market results will be a recap of what did we find when we compared you to the external market. And then lastly, the recommendations. So that'll obviously talk about, based on all the data we collected and we found, what do we propose that you all look at? Do you want to be clear just from the beginning? These are not, final recommendations that it's, hey, everything's there and you have to take them as they are. We certainly have the ability to adjust these per your feedback and per what we hear from you today. So we're giving you our first draft recommendations, but we'll be happy to adjust as needed. So with the study goals, we really had 2 main goals with this study and 2 things that we wanted to keep in mind throughout the entire process. Number 1 is to review your compensation systems for internal equity. And when we say internal equity, what that means is, how do your positions compare to one another? If you have 2 different people in the same job title, are they actually doing the same work? Are they, compensated in a similar manner? Not necessarily that they make the exact same amount of money. Maybe one of them's been here for 10 years and the other one just started. But if they're doing the same job, we want to make sure the compensation available to both of them is equitable. We want to make sure the titles accurately reflect that, hey, these people are in the same roles and are doing the same work. So that's from an internal perspective. We also look vertically, though, internally. So we look at an employee versus that employee's supervisor. If a supervisor has additional responsibilities, additional leadership, they have more complexity in their role, and they have to deal with more things, we would want to make sure that's compensated for as well. So that internal look goes both sideways, horizontally, or vertically between supervisors and supervisees. Then the second bullet is...
Can you stop just a sec?
Sure.
So I appreciate what you're saying and that you're going quickly,
Okay.
but when you're talking about horizontally, you said it so fast.
Okay.
You said you recognize that if people are in the same position, perhaps within the same department, have the same job description, and are doing basically the same jobs, their pay should be similar. But you also, I hope,
Mhm.
recognize that if a person's been in that position for a while, they would be making more money than the person who just came in brand new.
Correct. So the
Okay,
way I would
thank
say
you.
that is we want to make sure they have the same compensation available to them if they have the same credentials, the same experience, even the same performance in some cases. If there were a reason that we said, hey, this person is not going to get a step or they're not going to move this year, that's okay. That's a reason why we might differentiate pay. But if they're on the same pay grade, they have the same minimum, the same maximum, and the same pay available to them,
Good.
you are correct. The tenure could sometimes be a reason why people would make different amounts of
Okay,
money.
thank you.
Absolutely. And absolutely stop me for questions. Again, I'm trying to go quickly just to make sure we get to the right things, but I'll try to make sure I cover everything in enough depth for you all. But I'm happy to stop as needed. The second bullet there, the external equity. As I mentioned, that's the same things as the internal equity, sort of looking at comparisons between positions. But instead of comparing within your organization, we're comparing your positions to other organizations outside of the county here. So we might be looking at a city, we might be looking at another county, we might be looking at, again, any number of, we'll show you exactly who we compare it to in a moment, but we'll be looking at other local government organizations to ensure that if your people here are performing the exact same work as they were performing in another local government, is their compensation equal here? Is it the same as they would make somewhere else? Is it higher than they would get somewhere else, or is it lower? So those comparisons we want to make, again, in a similar manner. It's not that the actual take-home pay is always going to be identical, because we want to allow for the fact that you might have a brand new hire here, whereas they may have someone in another organization who's been there for 20 years. But we want to make sure that the pay ranges, the minimums, the maximums, and the advancement opportunities are there for people. So on the recommendations that we're going to make and that we're going to talk about today, we did look at both the internal and the external equity for every single position. So the recommendations are not just whatever the market average is, we recommend that. Sometimes we would recommend a little bit more than that if we need to make a differentiation for the internal comparison between positions. Sometimes we'd recommend a little bit less than that. But on par, on average, we're taking both into account. It would be a market equitable system. We go. So with the project phases, we have four basic phases that we would sort of divide the project into to get us to today. So phase one is the project initiation. That's where we started working with your organization. We started talking to HR. We started collecting information from you that we would use through the rest of the study. So that would include things like your job descriptions and your org charts, making sure that we understand your organization and how you all operate and how you all work today. It includes collecting things like employee salaries, employee pay ranges, policies, procedures, et cetera, that go with your current compensation and classification systems. So we collected as much as we could of that information. We talked about, again, timeline, goals, priorities for the project. So that initiation was really all about data collection and planning.
Question,
Yes.
whenever you were doing this, you weren't involving employee names. You were just involving their description and where they were within the description, right?
So at this point in the process, we technically did collect employee names at this point, but you're right. Most of the analysis is based on a position level or classification level analysis. So I don't know the
So you
difference.
took an actual versus what it would be if it was in a perfect world.
Well, so we made recommendations based on the classification. So you're correct that I didn't come in and say, John Smith or whatever example employee, we don't know them, we don't know their performance, et cetera. So we did say the position that they occupy, maybe administrative assistant, we said that position should sit here. Now, at the recommendations phase, you will see we did make individual recommendations for employees. So we'll talk about some of the ways we did that. That would have only included the data that was shared by employee here. So time is a good example. If John Smith had been here 10 years, we would have said an employee in the administrative assistant role who's been here 10 years would fit here. But you're right, it did not get into performance or any individual credentials like that from the person.
Okay.
Okay. So phase two is the internal analysis then. So with that internal analysis, we started reviewing your pay practices and your compensation, internally without looking at the market first. So the way we do that is we look at things like your pay structure, your pay grades, your pay ranges. We look at things like compression. So we'll touch on that in a moment, but we do look to see of the people in your pay grades, do they appear to have the correct distribution across the grade when we look at things like time and position? when we look at comparisons between employees and their supervisors. So those things came out in this internal analysis. And we were able to flag a few things. There were some positives that we said, hey, these are some strengths that we like about your current system. And there were some concerns that we say, hey, we want to keep an eye on this and we want to make sure you all are aware and your HR department is aware, again, into the future, because there are things you'll want to keep an eye on. Then we brought in the external market as well. So the external comparison, again, is basically our chance to say, are you doing things the same way your peers are? Are you paying a similar rate? Or again, are you paying more or less aggressively than your peers? So we'll touch on those results in a moment. But the external comparison was done on the position level. It was done based on job descriptions and job duties. So it was looking at, based on the roles and responsibilities that you have in place, if someone else at another organization had the same responsibilities and the same duties, how much would they be paid? And then we'll show you what that looks like when we get to the market results. Recommendations we've already touched on do include both the internal and the external piece. They do include things like this presentation we would consider part of this reporting phase, to actually come out and report to the public and to the commissioners, what did we find and what were the results thus far. But we will follow up with a written report as well. We've got a draft version of that, but we do like to wait and make sure if we have any direction from you all today, we can factor that into the report as well. So any changes or any recommendations that we have coming out of today would be included in that written document as well. So talking about the current system findings, this is what did we think when we looked at your pay scale and your pay systems just based on the internal piece of the study. So the strengths that we did see, you do have a simple, easy to understand pay structure. So your step and grade structure is consistent with what we would typically see. We feel like it can work well. We didn't have any major concerns with the overall structure of the pay scale. We did also notice, as the question was asked, the employees who have been here longer are typically making more than the employees who just started. Now, I know some of you might be thinking, hey, well, isn't that what a step and grade structure is supposed to do? But I can tell you from having worked all across the country, that's not always what we see in practice. Even though it is, yes, in an ideal world, we'd like people to come in and progress. Sometimes you don't see that. So we do want to commend you. Again, it does look like employees are moving through the structure over time as intended. Now, when we talk about some of the weaknesses or really just concerns to be aware of, number one, I did want to point out more than half of all of your employees are in the first quartile of the pay range. Now, what that means is the quartiles, if you take the first quartile, those are the people who are closest to the minimum of the pay range, the starting range. The second quartile would be the people above the minimum but closer to the midpoint. The third quartile would be people above the midpoint but not close to the maximum. And then the fourth quartile would be the people close to the maximum. You've got about 62% of your people who are close to the minimum. Now, a lot of those people are brand new. So this does indicate you either have had some new hires or some turnover and you're bringing in new people. That's okay. It doesn't mean you're putting them in the wrong spot, but it's a big number. And again, those are the people that we would typically say are most susceptible to turnover concerns, that they could leave. Because essentially, if you're at the maximum of your pay range, you might be below market. You maybe could think, hey, I could make a little more money. But if you go somewhere else, you might have to start over at the beginning. If you're at the beginning of your pay range, you may not feel like you have as much to lose. So if they say, hey, I can make a little bit more down the street, I'm going to start at the minimum there and the minimum's higher, those people are typically going to be a bigger risk for turnover. So this being a big number, we did want to point that out. We did also see about a quarter of your employees are making within 20% of their supervisor. Again, not incredibly alarming, but that 25% number, it does mean you have some people encroaching maybe into that yellow warning zone, we would say, near their supervisors. We don't think every single supervisor needs to have at least 20%, but when you start to get to the 10%, to the 5% range, that's where you start to ask the question, hey, are those people a little bit closer than maybe we would like to see based on that internal equity that I talked about before? If the supervisor has additional complexity and leadership, again, we would typically like to see that reflected. Yes.
In looking at supervisors, did you look at elected versus appointed?
I believe it was just the appointed supervisors. Yeah, I don't believe it was the elected.
Okay.
So
Wait,
again, we
Is
wanted
that correct, Desiree?
I did include some of the elected,
some of the elected.
yes,
during the-
but is majority of appointed.
Thanks.
So again, just something to be aware of. It is something we've looked at in our recommendations, is making sure the slotting is such that we do have some space as needed added in between those positions. But again, to be clear, there's a little bit of a warning group there getting a little closer than we maybe would want.
I would like to say one other thing. I could only pick 80 positions. So it wasn't just picking and choosing randomly. We went through it extensively. So I don't want other employees to think that they were left out for any reason.
Yeah, we'll touch on those 80 positions in a moment with the market survey. So I'll give you a little more detail on that in just a moment. But yeah, definitely a good point to be aware of. I think the market, yeah, perfect. The market's coming up now, so we'll touch on that now. Perfect timing here. So over on the right-hand side, we did receive responses from 14 different peer organizations. So that included 9 counties and 5 cities. You'll see them listed over there to the right-hand side. We did adjust responses for cost of living. So that's the first thing I'll mention is, again, we understand that not every single organization, cost of living is not the same everywhere. So if we looked at you compared to another organization, we would have adjusted either up or down depending on the cost of living between that organization. Now, it was not a huge difference. So you'll see on the next slide, we'll actually show you what magnitude of change that resulted in. It was not a huge difference because, again, most of these peers are relatively local, in the region here. And again, there's some peers that are a little more expensive, some that are a little less expensive. But I do want to make sure we're clear. Employees would not be penalized, by comparing to a cheaper peer or a peer with that's a less expensive cost of living. And likewise, again, the county is not going to be essentially paying higher rates than they would need to by comparing to a more expensive organization or jurisdiction here. Now, we did look at 80 different benchmark positions. That's what Desiree just mentioned a moment ago. With those 80 positions, what we do is we actually select positions that are representative of the organization overall without selecting every single position. So what that means is pretend you have, a level 1 position and a level 2 position. So if you've got a mechanic and a mechanic senior, or if you've got an administrative assistant and administrative coordinator, we don't need to compare to both of those levels because we know how those positions will fit next to each other internally. So if we find that your mechanic, for example, is below market, we also know the mechanic senior would need to be adjusted as well. So you can do that all the way up and down the organization. So again, if you think of a typical finance family, you might have a technician, assistant, specialist, analyst, manager, assistant director, and above. If you sample 3 or 4 of those positions instead of the entire family, you can still make recommendations for the family as a whole because you know how they fit in together. So we did select those 80 representing the entire organization. And on those 80 positions, we had an average match count of about 8 matches per position. Again, that 8 matches is a very good number. We like to see that for sure above 5. But once you start to get to that 7 or 8 range, you feel really good about the comparisons across the board. The reason it's not close to 14 is because we only compare your positions to those at the other organizations that have a matching, the duties and the job descriptions match at a rate of about 75% of the duties. And so again, if they have a manager and you have a coordinator, those positions may not be, quite close enough to make a comparison. So we would just leave the comparison blank from certain organizations. And so by that, virtue, we're making sure that we're only comparing similar jobs and duties.
So if you had a records clerk in the county,
Mhm.
you would look at a records clerk in a city, it's pretty much the same
Correct. Yes. And again,
responsibilities.
it's not just based on the titles, but you're exactly right. A records clerk, they may do the exact same things between a county and a city. Yes, we might have found that. But again, you might find a records clerk here and you might find, some sort of a records specialist or coordinator somewhere else where maybe they have some additional higher level duties.
So you compared all those factors.
Correct. And we use the job descriptions to make that comparison again
Okay.
at each of those organizations.
Thanks.
So you would not have used wastewater treatment plant operator
Mhm.
against a motor grader operator. I mean,
Correct.
that's apples and elephants.
Correct. We
But
would
you
not have
just
compared.
pick, somebody that's in the same level.
That's exactly right. That's
So,
correct.
so not just what the position title was, but you looked at their job description as a determining factor to compare.
Correct. So the position titles do match in most cases, but not all. It is possible, like a records clerk could have been compared to an administrative specialist or an office assistant if they did the same duties at the other organization. So moving on to the results then of the study on this chart on the left-hand side. So those 3 boxes on the left, those actually show the market differentials compared to your minimum midpoint and maximum of your ranges. The minimum obviously is that step one, that starting rate. The maximum is the highest step, the top rate. The midpoint, we just use the average. So it's not a specific step or specific area. It's just the average between the two to show a point of comparison there. You're about 14% below the market there. When we factor in the cost of living, it's only about 13%. So again, not a huge change. There's about a 1% difference there, but that's just to show you all that, again, it wasn't a wild swing or shift, but there was a small change that occurred. On the all the way right-hand side, the average actual salary comparison, what that shows is it actually shows the take-home pay of your employees versus the take-home pay of the employees in these other organizations. Now, on an individual basis, we are very cautious about using this number. We don't want to make a comparison on a one-to-one basis because of, again, what we've already talked about a couple times. You might have an administrative assistant who just started. They might have an administrative assistant who's been at their county for 30 years, and they may make a lot more. That might be okay because they may be at the top of their range and you're at the bottom of your range. So for any individual position, we would be cautious about using the data. But across all positions, we found that you're about 19% below the market on that actual take-home pay. That shows, given that your ranges are about 13% behind, it shows that you're paying slightly less than your peers on average in terms of looking at where you're paying inside your pay range. So your employees are a little bit closer to the minimum.
Now, whenever you're looking at ranges, you're looking at potential take home, not actual take home. Because actual take home has insurance and
Correct. So
different
this is
deductibles.
not, yeah, this is not looking at the insurance rates or that. This is the salary compensation here, these numbers that we're
Okay. So
comparing
that's
here.
the
Yeah.
beginning number, the total number.
That's what this is here. That's correct. Yes, we did look at some benefits. We do have that comparison as well. But again, these numbers here are the base pay only, those comparisons there. And again, I think this highlights what we talked about earlier, what we said 62%, I think, of your employees are close to the minimum. So again, the fact that your actual take-home pay is lower than your peers, do I say it's troubling? Yes, in a way, it is a little bit troubling just because we want to make sure we're competitive. But at the same time, I think making sure you all maintain your system will take care of that over time. As your people stay here longer, they are advancing into the pay ranges. So I did want to highlight that. I want to show you that, again, your actual pay is a little bit lower. I think that's mostly a function of the tenure of your organization, where you have a lot of newer employees, a lot of new hires that are making close to the minimum. As they stay here, I expect that will even out over time.
What is the industry standard for a new employee? Like 2 years, 5 years? What do you consider a new employee?
So for a new employee in this context, I would say really anything under 2 or 3 years. When you start to get to that 5-year range, typically they would be well above the minimum.
Right.
They wouldn't be close there. But if you've been here 2 years, I would still say that would sort of count. Again, over the past few years, we have seen more turnover across the country. I think everybody's familiar again with the inflation that we had following COVID, the Great Resignation, all those things. I think that's driven a little bit more of that in some of the organizations we've worked with over the past 5 years as compared to the period before that.
But do you take into account pay that's included in maybe getting an advanced degree in law enforcement
Mhm.
or maybe took an accounting course or
Mhm.
something where they advanced within their pay grade? In that realm, was that part of their base salary then?
Typically, that's not part of the base salary. Typically, that's something that's an additive or a benefit that we would have looked at separately. So again, we do have some of that information, but it's typically not given as a base pay. Some organizations do, so it's not universal. Some organizations will give you a step in the system, but a lot of them, what they'll do is they'll say you get a 5% supplement if you have this certification, or you get a 5% or 2%. Some certifications are worth a little bit less. But that's not what this is showing.
Okay.
So do you ever, when you're making up the list of somebody's peers, as you would call them, do you ever take the consideration the makeup of their tax base?
So the tax base specifically is not something that's compared to directly. Although when we look again in your organization, we do try to compare to other counties as well as cities from the local area that may have similar characteristics. So yes, that we do expect there is a lot of similarity there. But again, we don't look at again essentially the tax revenue to eliminate or add peers in. If you'd like to see again how it turned out in this list, we're certainly happy to provide that and basically show what does the tax base look like for each of these organizations?
Because in this county, we have a high percentage of residential,
Mhm.
and then a big part of the counties and cities listed
Mhm.
on here, they have a high
Mhm.
percentage of industrial tax base.
Mhm. Okay, I
They
would
don't
be
have
happy
the voters
to,
griping at them as
yeah.
much if they get pay raise.
And, and also,
Mhm.
not a complaint of how you did the test, but comparing counties and cities together
Mhm.
is not really the same thing because
Mhm.
county's responsibilities are entirely different than city's responsibility.
Mhm.
You may have a parks manager and swimming pool manager,
Mhm.
both listed under parks,
Mhm.
but we don't have either,
Right.
but if you just took and picked and choose,
Mhm.
it, I don't know how you would delineate the city of Victoria versus the
Mhm.
county of Victoria.
Mhm.
Because, I mean, their jobs, even though job descriptions may be the same,
Mhm.
their responsibilities are widely different and their tax base.
Yeah, so we do in a way rely on their job descriptions being accurate. So again, to the extent that they're doing things outside of their description, there could be a little bit of I guess I'll call it float
Well,
between the
For
duties.
example,
Mhm.
county may have an operator level one
Mhm.
for a motor grader.
Mhm.
And the city may have a equipment operator
Mhm.
for maybe a different piece of equipment, but it's
Mhm.
still the same basically job description.
Yeah, the thing we're ultimately looking for, what we want to find when we make these comparisons are, would your employee operating in this context here, would they be qualified for the other role from a competitive
Right.
standpoint?
Okay.
Because
makes
one of
sense.
the examples I use, not necessarily in this case, but we've used it a lot in Texas cities who are maybe right outside of, Houston or San Antonio or Dallas. They'll say, well, no, that that's bigger, it's larger, they've got more money, whatever. And I say, that's true. But if they're hiring at a rate, it's 25% higher than yours, is your employee going to say, well, no, I don't want to go work there. They have more, higher tax base. I don't care that they'll pay me a higher salary. That's not realistic. Your employee's going to say, well, no, I'm going to go work there because they're going to pay me more money. So again, we want to be respectful of that. We don't want to artificially inflate your sample, but we also don't want to ignore a competitor who could hire one of your employees away
Okay.
just because they have a little bit of a basically an advantage, in that tax base, that revenue.
I would like to also say at the beginning stages, they did send this list to me of the organizations, and I sent an email out asking for feedback if any of the organizations needed to be changed, and I didn't get any responses. So the list is what it is.
Well, and there are 10 counties here, but as Commissioner Casterline mentioned, and I was thinking to myself, the tax base is significantly different in our county, which we recognize we still need to pay our employees,
Mhm.
A reasonable salary, but it certainly constrains what we can offer because we don't have a Steel Dynamics in our backyard just throwing money at the county.
And the thing is, our tax base is low, but by the same token, within driving distance, the three adjacent counties all, they have a different tax base, but they're within driving distance for our existing employees. So that becomes a factor we have to address.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and Commissioner Russo, I think that's a great point, and it really gets into the next thing is kind of the recommendations that I have and how you all might want to adjust these and if we need to make a change to what we did. So we mentioned again, if there's 10 other counties in there and we're comparing to those, right now, the recommendations, I'll put it out there now before we go to that next slide. I've slotted you at the average. So I said, hey, we're going to be right in the middle. So half of these are going to be above you, half of these are going to be below you. But you may decide, you say, look, we just realistically can't compete in the middle. We think everybody else, the list of cities and counties we looked at, they may have more resources than you. So if we need to drop it from the 50 percentile right in the middle to the 40 percentile, that's still close. That's still competitive. It is still in the midst of things, but we can do that if we say, hey, we need to take a more realistic look at things. So that's something we can do. But let me talk about sort of what our process was now, and then we'll talk about, do we want to see any changes or adjustments here? So the first thing that we did is we did look at your pay plan in general. So we did look at, what do we like about it? We talked before, it's got a good structure, a good system, the 15 steps, the 5% progression. We thought that worked. We didn't see any reason to change that. So we did keep your same general setup or structure of your pay plan. But with that, what we did is we actually updated the grades to bring them in line with the market response. So some of your grades at the beginning, there were no positions in the market that were falling as low. So we eliminated those and we said, hey, let's start it at an actual realistic market rate here. The second thing we did is actually say, hey, based on the positions you have, which pay grade would be more appropriate for your positions based on the market response. So as I mentioned before, you were about, I think, 13% below the market on average. Some of your positions were above market. Nobody was too far above, but I think some were 5% above, maybe one or two was 6 or 7% above. A lot of them were even further than 13%, though, 20%, 22%, whatever. So when we make recommendations, it obviously does not make sense to just move everybody 13% because somebody who's already 5% above, that's money you don't need to spend. That's just moving them further and further above. But also somebody who's 25% below, it's not going to help them to move them 13. I mean, maybe it helps a little bit, but it doesn't get them to where they need to be. So our recommendations on number 2 were based on assigning each position to the pay grade that made the most sense based on the internal and the external market response. So what that means is not every position moved the same. Some positions would move further. Some positions would move a little bit less based on the data as it pertained to that individual classification or job family or sort of position series together. Then number 3 is after you have the pay scale, after you have the positions on the right grades, you have to determine where do the people go? How do you slot the employees into the pay grades? So again, as I go forward, this is the average right here. We can, look at a different approach if we need to, but there are 3 different options here. All 3 of these make you market responsive in your pay ratings. All 3 of these bring you to the average pay of the market. But option number 1, the bring to minimum salary, what that does is it looks at your employees and it just says, are you making more than the base pay of your range? You might have been here 10 or 15 years. We might have recommended your grade to move up by 10%. But if you're making more than the minimum of that new range, we don't adjust that employee at all besides just moving them to the closest step. So we just say, hey, you don't need an adjustment. You're already above the minimum. You go to the closest step. The good thing about this approach is it is less costly. Again, you see here, it's about half the price of some of the others. It is the less costly approach. But the bad thing about this is it does not look at time. I think you asked Commissioner Rousseau about, what about somebody who's been here for longer? What about somebody who's been in the range longer? This ignores that. It just says, hey, if you're above the range, you go to the closest step and that's it. You have a question?
Yes. When you look at the data you had in there, we had I want to say probably 30% of the employees, 35% were making, I want to say pretty close to the market, but then you look at, we have a big group of employees, say 9% and making 17 to 19% less. And then another group around 7% making 12 to 14% less. Does this address all of them from every level, from the ones that are making 3% to the ones that are making 19% less? Does it?
So the first option that I've talked about here, it does address all of that from a pay range perspective, but it does not look at the employee's individual salary. So let's look at an example here.
Okay.
Let's pretend you're an employee and your pay range is 15% below the market, but you've been here for 15 years. So maybe you're at the top step. Okay. If we adjust your top step by 15%, you are still going to be making more than the minimum of your salary range, right? So your salary range has shifted, but you would not receive an increase in this approach except to round you to the next closest step because you've been here for a long time. So that does not address the individual employees versus that market differential. So that's the downside of the first option. The first option is less expensive, but it absolutely has a drawback. The second option, I think, does exactly what you're asking, is it adjusts the employee and it adjusts the range together. So that same step approach basically says, if you're on step 7 now, you'll stay on step 7. If you're on step 2 now, you'll stay on step 2. If you're on step 10 now, you'll stay on step 10. Just wherever you are now, you'll stay. So if your pay scale slides over by 5%, you'll get a 5% increase. If your pay scale slides by 20%, you'll get a 20% increase. And if your pay scale doesn't move because you were above the market, you won't move. You'll keep your same salary, again, if you were above the market.
And that's your second option then?
That's the second option there. It's called the same step approach. So the thing we like about the same step approach, again, is it's a very consistent approach. It gives everybody the market differential that we adjusted the pay ranges by. It does not correct any of the compression in terms of people who have not moved as far as they should on the step basis. So if you should be on, let's say, step 5 and you're on step 4, it's still going to keep you on step 4. So it doesn't correct that. But what it does do is it gives 100% of the adjustment that employees should have had based on the market. So that's the strength of the option. Again, it is quite a bit more expensive, but it does maintain your current placement, which we found to be good for the most part. We felt most of your employees are where they should have been, just on ranges that were a little below the market. So this would correct a good deal of that.
Is there a feasible plan or is it a possibility to do that same step approach, but phase it in over about maybe a 3-year period or something like that?
We absolutely could. The next slide will give you one possible option for that, but there are some additional ones I'll talk through. There's a number of different approaches you could do to get this route, but yes, that is, you're correct. So before I go on to the next slide, I want to talk about the third option, then we'll go to the next slide, which is the last one, and we'll have as much time for questions as y'all want. So the third option here is called the class parity step. And basically what that does, the parity approach there basically says, how long have you been in your position? If the answer is 5 years, you would go to step 5 and your new pay grade. If the answer is 10 years, you go to step 10 in the new pay grade. If the answer is 1 year, you go to step 1. So we basically look at how long has an employee been in their role, and therefore what step would they be rounded to in this new system. So it's a little bit more expensive than the same step approach. The reason for that is it does correct a little bit more of that compression that we saw. Again, wasn't a huge degree of it, but there was a little bit. This does also provide people market competitive ranges. It does also basically say the positions that moved the furthest versus the market would have the employees moving the furthest in the range. So if your position was 20% below market, you would expect to see your people getting about 20%, with some small deviations, again, based on time in position. So that's the third option. And again, is the most expensive option, but it is also probably what I would call, more of the gold standard in terms of if salaries, if money was not an option. If you told me, hey, Mark, we've got all the money in the world, I'd probably lean you towards this option. We know that's not realistic. We understand that's not. So I'm not suggesting we have to go that option, but I do want to be clear. It does probably the most to address compression and the market altogether. So
But
those are your three options.
my question is, how does time and position necessarily mean that you should get, if everything else is the same, why you should get a raise? If you're in a position for 10 years and doing the same thing you did 10 years ago versus somebody that's coming in just as a beginning, I realize that there's some expertise that come into that, but should you be paid for 10 years? And it's just a question.
Sure.
Should you be paid for being there 10 years, doing the same thing that somebody's been there 3 years?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And there are two reasons why I would say we typically do recommend that you adjust people based on time in the position. So the two reasons are, number one, because everybody else is doing it, it is a competitive reality. Whether you like it or not, if you say, hey, we're going to pay you one rate and that's the rate and that's all you're going to get, your employees can look at 14 other peers on there that are going to say, well, we'll give you additional. So come over here. So there is a degree to which you're essentially paying the price for what everybody else is doing. That is fair. It's a good point. The second thing is, in local governments, we have worked with many organizations across the country to implement performance-based systems. You can do a performance-based system well. I'm a firm believer it can be done. But what I also will say is it is very difficult to do it. So it can be done, but what it requires is it requires every one of you to be on the same page. It requires you to fund it to a degree that employees actually care about the performance differentials. It requires your managers and directors to fairly, utilize the system in the correct way. Because what we've seen in some of the organizations is they approach it, even the leadership team's on the same page, and maybe one department director says, well, I don't care. I'm going to give everybody the best, performance score they can, because that's going to help me keep my people. If that happens, and if you don't address that, that throws you out of whack really quickly. When one department, everybody's moving, and another department, people are staying down.
I think that's a factor also, because when you have a county judge and department heads, then you have other elected officials, you really can't have that consistency of the, performance-based system.
That's a great point. Again, the elected, it just throws one more wrench into it, because again, you can say, and we'll pick on the county judge and just say, hey, what, but again, if the county judge says, well, I'm going to give this person this because that's what I want to do. If it's an elected position, to a degree, is, well, does the elected, do the citizens care? And if they do, great, you've got an avenue there. But if you don't, we have seen that in other places where an elected department head, they just say, well, hey, I'm going to do it this way because I'm going to keep the best people I can, and I'm going to get elected again. And so that's all there is to it. So excellent point.
That's part of the problem we have right now.
Well, again, and that's why we do think in local governments, doing the tenure-based system, it's a good approximation. It's not perfect. There absolutely, I imagine there absolutely are people at your organization who have been here 2 or 3 years who are better than the people who get more work done, who work harder, who are smarter, who have more experience overall outside the county. There probably are people better than the tenure people in some cases. But I think overall, the competitive is number one. But I think also number two, again, we do expect, and it's up to, again, your organization, your leaders, your HR, your department heads, your managers to hold people accountable. Say, you've been here 10 years, you should be growing and progressing. I don't think it's perfect, but it's the fairest proxy we sort of have in local government. Okay.
So just a quick question,
Sure.
maybe. So in the same step approach,
Mhm.
did you say that if the people were way over the market level,
Mhm.
that they would still be adjusted and get an increase?
So
Or is that
if their
taken in
pay
consideration?
range moved, they would still move in the same step approach. But in the vast majority of cases, I guess I don't know every single slot off the top of my head, but in the vast majority of cases, again, if your pay range was above market, your pay range would not move, because we did recommend the pay ranges according to the market results that we
Okay.
got. So for those positions that were above market, again, we may have picked the closest pay range. It might have been 2% above what it is now, but they would not have gotten a 10, 15, whatever percent increase, because they didn't need to, based on the market we found they were in a competitive spot.
Okay,
So,
thank you.
so that recommendation would be that you would take every individual, job description, payrolls and performance and just make an analysis. And this one may get 5%, this may get 7%.
Mhm.
This one over here may stay the same.
Mhm.
And,
That's correct. And we have done that for these
If-
options.
if you
Mhm.
did that after 1 or 2 or 3 years,
Mhm.
then it'd be a lot easier to adjust your budget annually.
Mhm.
Because
Well-
you know if it's gonna, you know.
Mhm. Yeah, that's what this is here. So the final slide and final presentation here, this is the 3-year approach that we've given here. So this 3-year approach is kind of exactly what you all have asked about and what you all are saying. So in year one, you'll notice the same step approach goes down to about $750,000, whereas before I think it was about 1.2 billion or a little over 1 million. So again, there's a significant cost savings if you do break it into a 3-year approach here. Now in year 2 and year 3, you've got again an additional $750,000. That's each year you've got that $750,000. And so you would have to maintain this over time. If you just do year one and you don't do year 2 or year 3, what you're going to do is you're basically going to take a small step towards the market and you're going to remain behind the market. So you're going to fix some of your concerns. You were 14%, 13% behind now. You might be 9% behind or so, but you're still going to be below market. If you do all 3 of these, we have modeled this in a way that after 3 years, it will get you to a market competitive placement based on our projections. Now, again, projections are just that. We can't guarantee what your peers are going to do. We can't guarantee how the market's going to move for the next 3 years. But we believe this would put you in a competitive place after 3 years here by taking 3 smaller steps here versus the market. We would propose that when we make this recommendation, let's pretend you adopted this. You said, yes, we want to do this 3-year approach. We would recommend that each year your HR department and you all would evaluate the percentage increases in year 2 and in year 3 and decide, does that still fit your budget? And does that still fit the patterns you're seeing in the market? Because we could see, let's pretend we had another inflationary period. In year 2, if all of your peers are going to move by 7% and you're only going to move by 3%, you're going to fall further below. So you would need to take that into account. But let's also say maybe a worst case scenario, maybe there's a recession and your peers aren't moving at all. Maybe they move by 0%. You might not need to move as far in year 2 or year 3. So that would be something we would recommend that you all take a look at this each year. But we have given recommendations and we're happy to support to HR. If there's a question next year about, hey, what would you propose we move? We're happy to weigh in on that as well.
In
Yeah.
a 5-year approach, you never really get where you want to get. Is that correct?
I have done a very small, maybe 2 or 3 5-year approaches in my time at Evergreen. We do not recommend that for kind of the reason you're saying. It's such a small impact over 5 years. It really is hard to tell an employee 5 years from now you'll be where you want to be. I mean, that's a really hard thing to say. The other thing is the further you project out versus the market, obviously the less you know. Again, the reason we did one of them, I can think that the most recent one I did was in the state of Florida. They had a minimum wage increase, again, where it went from 11 one year to 12 the next year, 13, 14, 15, kind of marching your way up. So we had a little bit of a guide rail of what we thought people were going to pay because we knew that minimum wage increase was a big deal. So we did do a 5-year approach for them, but I will say, unfortunately, that 5-year approach started in 2019. And so you can imagine in 2021, they were coming back and saying, wait a second, Evergreen, this 5-year approach it's not working for us. Again, and we said, you're right. We did not factor a global pandemic into the recommendations. So again, that's the danger you run by going a 5-year. We don't recommend that. I do recommend 2 or 3 years if possible. And again, the other thing I would say, and I mentioned this earlier, let's say this 3-year approach is, no, Mark, that's too expensive. We can't afford that. If that's the case, we can break this down where we've got you to the 50th percent of the market right now, the middle of the market. Maybe you say, look, we can't do that right now. We have to do the 40th or the 45th. So we'll come in a little bit below market. We know that. But after 3 years, let's reassess and let's see if our financial positioning is enough to get us to that 50th percent. There's nothing wrong with that. Again, particularly you all have shared some concerns that maybe your tax base is not what others are. That is a very valid path you could take. But I would recommend that before I would recommend a 5-year approach.
If you take into account, say a moderately growth community,
Mhm.
would you employ COLA as part of the annual increase, the 5%, 7% plus COLA,
Mhm.
if we decide to do COLA? But if you don't do
Mhm.
COLA, then ultimately you'd be right back where you were.
Yeah, it depends on what you mean by COLA, but yeah, to the point of, do we recommend that you move your pay scales every year? Yes, we do. Your peers are going to move their pay scales every year. Now, maybe a small amount. So in some markets and in some climates, maybe it is only 1% or 2%. We have seen that before. But yes, we do recommend a small increase every year. We have some clients who they basically say, no, we're not going to do a COLA. And what they do is they'll do a study every 3 or 4 years, and every 3 or 4 years, they're behind market again. So we'll give a big jump and we'll catch them up to market. And then their peers just kind of move past them in the next 3 years. And we tell them, look, you all are bringing this upon yourself by not doing COLAs. They say, that's fine. We'll handle it every 3 years. You can do it. It's not what we recommend, but you can do that. But I would recommend take a small bite at the apple every year. Try to stay as close as you can. And again, we found you 13% behind right now. If you do this approach, if you do this 3-year approach, you should be close when it comes time to look at the market again in 3 years or whatever. But could you be 3% behind the market then? Yeah, you could. It's possible. But a 3% adjustment is a whole lot cheaper than a 13% adjustment. So part of the reason these costs are so high, again, is because we've got that catch up that needs to be factored in here.
So in the multi-year option, did you say you have a 3% COLA in each year?
The first year puts you sort of in a starting point here that would keep you again a little bit below the market. In the second and third years, we do have a 3% COLA built into this along with that market catch up. So again, you'll see the percentage of payroll is about 6% or 5% each year, but the pay structure itself would move by 3% each year to catch you up and get you a little bit closer to where you're supposed to be. So that was the 3-year approach that we built in. Yes.
So if you base it on getting it back in a period of time, and you use COLA as a guide with the increase each time, you take that off, that should theoretically keep you at the same level that you were at previous years.
You saying if you give the same COLA as everybody else, you'll be at the same percentage versus the market?
Well,
or-
assuming you use a universal COLA figure, I'm not about 7% or 2%, but say COLA goes up 3% or 3.5% and you adjust it, that's an automatic adjustment, not as a bonus from COLA, but as a change in the base salary, and the base salary. Then that way you have at least something that's definitive that you can look at and you can somewhat plan for.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, we do recommend that you look at a COLA adjustment every year for several reasons. But again, one of them is competitiveness. One of them is planning. If you know what that sort of base COLA that you're going to do each year is, that does help you plan ahead. It helps your finance, it helps your HR, it helps your employees, quite frankly, as they say, hey, I know if I come to work here, hey, maybe I'm not coming here to get rich. I understand I could maybe make more in the private sector, or I could go and, oil and gas, whatever. I mean, some of your employees certainly could make that decision. But they also could say, look, but if I come here, I know the progression I'm going to get. I have the consistency, I have the stability. of a local government, and I feel like I'm being treated fairly. We hear that all the time across the country
But
when you
the,
give those.
the way to ever get caught up is to get caught up immediately and then follow through.
If,
Not over a 3-year period.
well,
So
the.
you go over a 3-year period and it's 3%, you're already 6% behind.
Yeah. If you can do this, if you can do an approach like this, you're right. This is the gold standard. The gold standard is catch up today and then stay caught up. You are absolutely correct about that. So me showing the 3-year approach, I'm not trying to steer you any direction.
No.
If you all want to go with this approach, we love, again, this approach. We do feel like it would get you to the market. If you go with any of these 3 options, your ranges would be market competitive. If you go with the second or third option, I would tell you your employees are where they're supposed to be as well. If you go with the first option here, I think your ranges would be in a good spot. I think your employees would have a little bit of compression. So I would not tell you your employees are perfect in that first option. But if you go with option 2 or 3, I would say that's the gold standard. Either of those would be an excellent approach. It would bring you to market competitiveness now. And you're exactly right. Next year, you need to make sure your COLA matches what your peers do. And then you're exactly where you need to be. That's correct.
I wanted to be clear, the salaries in this study are the current salaries, right? After our,
Correct. Do you remember the date we pulled those salaries? There may be some updating to do, but yeah, as of a couple
March or
months ago.
April.
Yeah.
okay, so we're in this budget year.
Yeah.
And then do our benefits take into account the total package, our retirement, medical?
So we've got other recommendations on the benefits that basically are showing you how competitive you are on the benefits. This is not factoring in benefits such that if your medical's 2% higher, we drop your salary by 2%. We didn't do it that way, but we do have the benefits as well. So you could do a combined adjustment and basically say we adjust the salaries and we may look at, do we need to make adjustments to benefits at the same time? So you would have the ability to do that.
They don't have our new benefits though, that are starting in October.
Okay. Yeah. Then we do not have the new, if that's going to be a big change in October.
Yeah, I have a question when, we were looking at the comparable counties and governments. I didn't see San Patricio County. It's right next door to us. And I was wondering why why it was left out.
Yeah, I'd have to double check. There were a few additional, so we got responses from 14 peers. I think we surveyed 17 or 18. So there were
They
a
were
couple who
surveyed.
did not answer.
Okay.
I can double check to make sure. I don't know if you remember off the top of your head.
I believe they were on the
They were?
list.
Okay.
Okay.
Typically, we would use the immediate neighbors in almost all cases. So my assumption is they either said, I can double check exactly why, but sometimes if their HR department is a little overwhelmed, they'll tell us we can't participate right now. We don't have the time.
Okay.
Sometimes if they're doing their own study. they'll
But you did
say,
attempt to
"We're-
reach
we're
out to
changing."
them. Okay. That's
I believe so,
okay,
yes.
Thank you.
And I think when we've done studies before, we've not had a response from them.
Okay. Sometimes this
Some of my
another
remember.
organization is just a little less likely to help out. That's fair.
So I want to ask a question. If we
Sure.
did the multi-year option,
Mhm.
say on the same step, where you have percent of payroll, 6.2%,
Mhm.
can you explain to me what that means?
A 6.2% increase in payroll, that's essentially just a way for you all to conceptualize how big of a bite at the apple you're taking. So again, 6% means your total payroll expense in the budget would increase by 6% that year.
For
That
the
would
first
include
year.
a COLA.
Excuse me?
That would include a COLA.
The 3-year approach did include COLAs for years 1, 2, and 3. Again, it is a projected COLA. So we would tell you, double check it next year, double check it in year 3 to make sure. But yes, they do include COLA increases in those 3 years.
And so then for year 2, the 6.3 is what the cost would be.
Correct. It would
Increase.
mean that your cost would increase, your salaries would increase by 6.3. And keep in mind, that's a 6.3 compounding on the year before.
Right.
So you've done 6 the first year and 6 the second year. It's really about a 12 or so in total. That's correct.
Thank you.
That total salary cost, like same step, year 1, 749,000.
Mhm.
I mean, that's all new money.
It is.
And then it
Yep.
Right.
adds for next year. How much can we raise with 1 penny? And wasn't it like 250?
It's about taxes.
I
So going
think it was
forward after
about
we got
250 or something like that, right? So
So going forward, after we get this 3-year program,
Mhm.
what would we be looking at yearly? Do you have?
So after the 3-year approach, if you got caught up to the market, again, it's hard to say what's going to happen
Right,
3 years
right.
from now, but typically I would think your peers are going to move their salaries probably about 2 to 3% per year in a normal economy. For the last 5 years, that's not true. They're probably moving more than that. But I would say if you budget for a 2 to 3% COLA, and then with the step increases, again, employees would get an additional 2 or so. So probably about a 4% payroll increase would be what I would say.
3-4% per year, something like that.
Correct. Somewhere in that range. Now, again, there's always going to be variation. It could be higher or lower, but that'd be about what I would say on average.
So we probably need to, if we select one of these,
Mm.
we need to look at it again, budget next year. Say, okay, we need to adjust it, stay 3 years
Mhm.
out all the time in our projections.
You can keep a projection going 3 years out. That's a very reasonable thing to do. Again, when I talk about adjusting
one
for
out.
next year, yeah, the very least what you would do is you'd say, hey, Evergreen has a 3% in here. Does that seem feasible? Can we afford that? Are our peers moving more? Again, we would suggest HR would make phone calls to your surrounding counties and say, hey, how much are you moving your pay scales by this year? And if every single one of them tells you they're moving it by 5%, let's say again, it's a hot market, they're all moving by 5%. I would tell you, you need to upgrade, and do more than the 3. But again, I wouldn't anticipate that. That's not what we're projecting right now. We are projecting that economy kind of cooling. And so again, we would expect they're going to be more in that 2 to 3% range. But you're correct. You would look at it every year. You would have that projection. And then again, I think the question over here was, could we have a consistent sort of approach that we would look at? Yeah, if you all would want to budget for a 2% COLA every year or a 3% COLA every year, that will keep you in the ballpark. And then we would propose every 3 to 5 years, take a more detailed look, take a more sort of targeted approach like we did here to make sure you're on track.
Well, we're in a kind of a unique position,
Mhm.
we being the area here. Because if they get the RO system in the where they got the water and we can get definitive water,
Mhm.
the expansion around here, I heard a figure one time was like $3 billion
Mhm.
over the next 4 to 5 years.
Mhm.
And, there's no other place hardly
Yeah.
around that's doing that type of expansion, so our costs are gonna go up.
Mhm.
But, we don't have a lot of industry here in Aransas County.
Right. Well, again, every organization that we work with across the country is in a little bit of a different circumstance, but yeah, additional money, that's going to mean additional services you're going to need, additional revenues you're going to get, but additional costs you're going to have as well. So yeah, you may need to do again an additional evaluation if you have a significant change in what things are going to look like. But I would say on balance, if everything goes kind of how it's going right now, a little bit of progression, a little bit of growth, keeping a consistent movement every year is the way to go.
The further, I guess, from your standpoint too, the further we kick the can down the road, this is gonna be exponentially that much more
yeah.
expensive to get caught up.
It is going to be more expensive in terms of the salaries, but the additional thing I would note is, again, some employees are willing to stick around and say, well, I'm 5% behind. Okay, whatever, it's not worth it to move. Well, I'm 7% behind. Well, it's not worth it to move. I like it here. I like my coworkers. Eventually there's a point where people are going to say, well, I'm not staying. So then you start to run into compounding effects of it's expensive to hire, to new people. You've got the turnover costs, you've got services not being
Training.
provided, training, yeah, all of that. And so again, what we've seen with a number of organizations too, they say, well, we wouldn't do an increase last year. We wouldn't pay this person this amount. When we tried to hire somebody from the outside, we had to pay more than they asked for. They might ask for a 5% increase. They had to hire 10% above because they couldn't get anybody else in the role. So you run the risk of that. Again, I'm not suggesting that if you don't do an increase right now, whatever, every one of your people is not going to quit, but you are running the risk. The further you push this out, the further you say, hey, we're not going to address this now, that definitely increases the probability you have those turnover concerns, and those additional costs associated with that.
Are we thinking about doing this and implementing it this year, or are we talking about it and looking at building it into the 2026 budget?
I don't know about this year because we got to see where we're at,
Okay,
but I mean, definitely we could discuss this during our budget.
Okay.
time.
Yeah, but you're gonna have to come up with the numbers on what you were talking about. How much can we raise
Right,
taxes in 1 year? This is a pretty big
that's huge.
click. You might not be able to legally raise it that much.
Yeah.
You're wrong.
Well, we've got something to look at now.
Right.
And so I think that the value to this is that we got at least a starting point.
Absolutely.
The
Mhm.
timing is such that I'm not sure we could even get it in this budget
Okay.
because, we have to set the budget just in a few months.
Mhm.
And, I don't know,
Mhm.
but we cannot continue not doing this.
Right.
And so I think we ought to go to the next step.
Well, again, as you all continue your deliberations and as you all, make sort of determinations of what you can and can't afford, please, let HR know they can communicate to us. We're happy to rework the file for you. If we need to break it into a 2-year approach where you say, hey, here's all we can afford this year. What would you propose for next year? We can give you a 2-year approach. If you want to see the 3, whatever, that's fine too.
I would think that we would need to at least be able to communicate with you with where we were whenever we ended this year
Mhm.
versus I don't anticipate that this is a one-time shot.
Sure. The other thing, I guess I didn't mention this before, I've sort of been focused on the 3-year approach with doing the same approach every year. The other thing you could consider, again, if finances are tight, you can do the bring to minimum approach in year 1. That does add compression, but it's the least expensive option. So in year 1, you do the bring to minimum approach. Then in year 2, you could apply the same step or the class parity approach. Again, and you could apply a portion of that too. So you could break it up that way. That is something people have done. The only caution I have for that, again, is we want to make sure there's a commitment from you all that you would say, hey, we really do want to go with one of those other approaches.
Would you explain that again?
So the bring to minimum approach, remember, that's the one that adjusts the pay ranges, but it does not adjust the people unless they're below the minimum of the pay range.
That'd be that 500.
That'd be the 500,000 for the first year. So if you went with an approach like that, that would get your pay ranges caught up in 1 year. Your pay ranges would be market competitive now, but your employees would experience some compression.
That was,
If you do it for 1 year and then in year 2, you say, well, now we're going to fix the compression. Again, I think that's it's an approach and a path you can sell. You can say to the employees, look, this is all we can afford this year, but we are addressing compression in year 2. I think that's a good approach. It is something that gives you something strong to basically market yourselves on. Is, hey, we're getting market competitive with our ranges now, and we're going to address compression in year 2.
well, in year 2, how would that affect the budget?
That would increase the cost basically by the difference of the year 1 and the year 2. So that'd be like 700,000 in year 2. If we went with that approach. So that would be a significant cost in year 2. That's the 700,000 before the COLA.
So on
So-
the bring to minimum, it's like a person that's been here 1 year is going to get paid the same as a person that's been here 10 years.
Correct.
Yeah, I think that would be a disincentive.
It would, particularly if it's a long-term approach. Again, I only would propose that if it's going to be a multi-step phase. If you do it and say, hey, for 1 year, we're going to accept the compression because that's all we can afford. And in year 2, we fix it. Again, that I have seen that work very successfully for other places, but I want to caution, if you do that approach and then in year 2, you don't implement the compression changes, you've basically created a bigger issue. So I would only, again, put it out there as if it's something you all feel you can commit to. I think it could work. If there's concerns, if there's cautions, if we don't want to go that route, we don't want to have the compression for a year, then very, very understandable as well.
Year 2, you'd be looking potentially at over $1 million too, right?
With a COLA, you would, yes. So basically, you're just saying we're going to divert the cost to year 2. We've got a year to figure out how to pay for it. We've got a year to get the funds and to rebudget and allocate. But you're right. You would basically be just saying in year 2, it's going to be $1 million or it's going to be very expensive in year 2.
And in the meantime, you've offended a great number of employees.
You
Yeah.
have in the short term, I think the marketing would be important to make sure they understood that, hey, we're not doing this, we don't
I
care.
don't
but-
think we have that kind of right.
Okay.
I agree.
Again, I'm not trying to push it on you. If
No.
you've got
Hey, don't.
concerns of it, that's totally fine. I just want to make sure you knew it was an option, but if it's not an attractive option, we're gonna throw it away, that's fine.
So
I'd like to see at a lower percentile, because right now Mark said we're in the 50th. Would y'all want to see the study at like the 40th percentile? So we're a little below average?
I don't think so. I would
No? Okay.
also.
So, and did you say that you did a comparison on our benefits package? too?
We do have a comparison of the benefits package. Yeah, that's separate than this. We can send that over too for y'all to take a look at. And so you all would be able to make that deliberation of, hey, how do we feel about our benefits? As mentioned, again, I guess I don't have the most current benefits. So if you want to send the new benefits, we can show you what are your new benefits going to look like versus the market now. So if you'll.
We
send
just
that up-
changed it. We voted to have dual options.
Okay, perfect.
So
Yeah, then we'll get that updated based on your new benefits and we can send that over and y'all can take a look.
Also, so what's our next option? Are we gonna need to take any action on this?
But to date,
no,
it's not an action item.
it's discussion.
No, I'm not talking about right now, but that's just gonna become part of what we decide to do on the budget.
Right.
Okay. Cool.
Discuss it.
And do you have a list of the salaries that? I mean, you did it by position, but you didn't take all of our positions.
Well, I did give them
Go
every employee and every position and every pay that everybody has. But the benchmarks, like the ones they focused on that they compared it to the market, that was 80. They didn't compare every single employee.
But a good representation.
Yes.
So you basically.
It
have a
was-
List to show ones that are under and ones that might be over.
Yes, he listed every single employee, whether they're over or under.
All right, any other questions?
Appreciate that data.
Absolutely.
Anna, do you have any questions?
The number you're asking about, there'll be no way to figure it out.
Oh, okay.
Okay, no way. But, because it
Well-
would have to be based on whole numbers.
Right.
But we do have a chart that I give to Jackie every year that says that we raise it a penny, we raise it 2 pennies, 3 pennies. Which I would give her that too with the number,
Okay.
so you would be able to work with, it. You would see that, be able to work with. it.
So what's the legal number that we can raise per year then? Without going to elect.
3.5%? 2.5? Oh, I thought it was 3.
I think you have one, I have to say, but I don't remember.
Yeah, they did go away.
Can I
Double check that.
ask Jackie a question?
Yes.
Jackie, from what the numbers you're looking at right now, what you've looked at, I know y'all work on the budget. What we've been presented here, do you see us? Is this something that can be potentially be looked at for the 2026 budget?
I'm looking at Tana because she's been doing the budget. I
Okay.
haven't.
Well, Tana, let's put you on the spot.
Put you on the hot seat now, huh?
I mean,
And
really,
I'm not asking for a firm answer, but just,
it's really going to be based on what our tax rate's going to be and what our new tax income will be on it. It's really hard to tell because that's the
At
biggest
this time, you
unknown
can't.
right now. Until we can calculate the tax rate, we really don't have a good number.
I bet that number is lower than what we've been used to in the last few years.
I don't know, I'm thinking.
You might want to come to the microphone, Tana, just so. No, you might want to come to the microphone. Okay.
I was just saying that August 4th is our next round of workshops and we'll have a better idea of revenue.
That we can wait till then.
Right.
I mean, that's just next month.
When is budget finalized? Like, when do we need to vote on this by?
We'll
Tomorrow?
be adopting the budget by
End of August.
September.
first part of September.
Okay, so after August 4th, we can
Oh, yeah.
decide.
We'll have plenty of time after that. We'll have plenty of workshops
Okay,
and time to work on it.
Cool. All right.
To adjourn.
thank you.
Thank you all very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I move to adjourn.
Second.
Got a motion second?
Commissioner Cheney,
Aye.
Commissioner Casterline,
Aye.
Commissioner Russo,
Aye.
Commissioner Dupnick,
Aye.
Judge Garza.
Aye. Thank you, Mr. Holcomb. We are adjourned.